very appreciative that you were able to accommodate my request because I'd like to use this as a forum for announcing that conditions are getting extremely delicate in Europe and Ukraine, and I've got some pretty hot news about how Germany is breaking away. They're not in the US fold anymore.
Hello and welcome. Today is August the 31st, 2014, Labor Day weekend, and this is Paul Sandhu coming to you with another episode of Wake Up and Live Radio. It is my pleasure to once again welcome one of our favorite guests on this program, Jim Willie, the Golden Jackass. Jim is the editor of the Hat-Trick Letter, which is published on his website, goldenjackass.com. So without further ado, hello and welcome, Jim.
Oh, it's good to be back. I'm very appreciative that you were able to accommodate my request because I'd like to use this as a forum for announcing that conditions are getting extremely delicate in Europe and Ukraine, and I've got some pretty hot news about how Germany is breaking away. They're not in the US fold anymore, and it's pointing out an extreme split in Germany. On one side, you have the bankers, the politicians, and the EU elite. And on the other side, you have the commercial interests that are not interested at all, have no vested interest at all in destroying their economy. The U.S. is trying to export a war, create a huge enemy with Russia, cut them off, scorched earth, and the victims are going to be the Europeans led by Germany, and they want no part of it. So I've got some extreme news to share, and I thought it would be good to do it with you. You're my buddy, and we have a good time talking and chewing over a lot of different things. And I thought this would be a really nice forum for sharing some pretty critical information regarding Germany.
Jim, you know, your information is always valued and appreciated by myself and my audience. Judging from the number of views that our programs get, by far exceeds any of the other guests that I bring on. Not that what the other guests present is not important, but it seems like your straightforward, your in-depth analysis and your logical conclusions of that analysis are most valued. And I would agree and concur that I have been hearing noises, even in the mainstream press, coming out of Germany that are absolutely opposed to these sanctions. As a matter of fact, yesterday there was a blurb on one of these 24-hour news channels that the EU is considering more sanctions against Russia. And insanity like that, I think, is going to hasten the split between Germany and the Anglo-NATO US-UK faction. So tell us what it is that you've been hearing and what is this earth-shattering news that you want to share.
Well, let me read you a quote from The Voice. And The Voice has got a lot of very solid connections with numerous different security agencies and central banks. His sources are amazing. I always kid him. I say things like, well, it's an amazing Rolodex you have. Okay, here's his quote. This is from yesterday. This is fresh news. Ukraine, I'm quoting him. I'm reading his words. This is astounding news. The Ukraine military is getting crushed. There's an incredibly high influx of very well-trained soldiers from France, England, Germany, Holland, and other Western European countries. These Western soldiers are battle-proven professionals who are lending the Eastern Ukrainian forces an enormous power punch. Ukraine military is totally demoralized, and the defections are very high. The Western Kiev puppets are making plans to leave the country, trying to escape to safety, as the common people in Ukraine are slowly getting the message how they've been betrayed and screwed over by their Western friends. The mainstream media can only keep feeding bullshit for so long. The French detachment, this is huge, the French detachment of the European freedom fighters, that's what he calls them, have captured an American Blackwater mercenaries group early this morning. They are currently being interrogated. This will be fun to see once they are paraded in front of the press. Okay, that's the end of the quote. Now, I just want to point out that next, we have the opportunity to coordinate government policy of sanctions by the same Western European governments, since it implies that countries are deeply divided at the top and should bring change, like from some government leaders. We got an inconsistency here, Dash, that the Germans, French, Dutch, and even the British are talking about sanctions, but those are the politicians who are run like puppets by the bankers. On the other side, you now have crack special forces type troops, battle-hardened expert professionals. He did not use the word mercenary. He just said crack professionals. They're working against the NATO side in Ukraine. So, what's the conclusion here? NATO is dead. It's nothing but official lip service. You've got European crack troops fighting against the US and EU elite mercenaries, paid, funded, and run by Langley and George Soros. This is just huge.
Now, Jim, do you expect to see a counteroffensive by NATO? I just read yesterday here in Toronto that Canada is sending 1,000 troops to Poland. Canada, of course, is a part of NATO. So do you think that NATO is amassing forces to actually put boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, I think they've already been involved with boots on the ground. They may.
No, I mean in an official capacity.
Well, I think they've already got some official backup capacity. I remember reading 3 or 4 weeks ago about German Air Force providing airstrikes. I mean, that's direct NATO involvement. I think they've been more involved in the background than in the front line, but we might see more of what you're referring to, counteroffensive. But I think it's going to fail miserably. We've now got momentum in the other direction. I don't like discussing war developments, troop movements and the big arrows of, tank divisions and all this. But one big message that I'm hearing consistently in the last month to month and a half is that you're seeing enormous numbers of lost military equipment by the Ukraine militia, the Ukraine loyalists, the regime battlers, the regime, I don't know what to call them. I call them the Kiev loyalists mostly. They're losing tanks, they're losing armored vehicles, they're losing, artillery equipment. The Kiev side is shelling residential communities in eastern Ukraine. I keep hearing the locations Lugansk and Donetsk. In those two areas, we're seeing now a remarkable phenomenon take place where the separatists, that's what they're calling the eastern folks who fight against Kiev, the separatists, the rebels, if you will, fighting against Kiev, they're creating columns, corridors, so that the official Ukraine army can retreat and surrender and go into Russia. And they're not being slaughtered. They're being given a meal, a warm place to sleep, and provisions, because these Kiev troops, these Kiev militias, they're being surrounded, they're running out of water, running out of ammunition, running out of food, and running out of supplies. And, you know, supplies are that's a big word, supplies. What's supplies? Well, it could be a number of things. It could be like, you know, fresh clothes. Their shirts are all worn down or ragged. It could be toilet paper. It could be any number of things like, you know, devices to open cans of food. They're running out of supplies. They're starving. They're desperate. They're out of water. They're out of ammunition. They're being shelled. They're being slaughtered. So Kiev is not supporting their own troops, and we're going to see a very big phenomenon coming soon, and that is that the troops that used to fight for Kiev are processed and, you know, indoctrinated a little bit, coached, whatever the word you want to use, and then they're going to start fighting against Kiev. So this is all turned bad, and I actually have some fresh news. It's like every day I'm getting some remarkable news. You want to hear what I heard today? I mean, this is amazing stuff.
Yeah, of course I'd like to hear what you heard today, Jim. Okay,
a different source. I've got a fellow named, I call him London Paul. He's a London banker type. He's not so much a banker anymore as a financial analyst, but he's a good guy. He's a very bright fellow. And he has a couple of clients in Russia. He's had them for a while. These are just, you know, these aren't weapons types of clients. They're retail, they're commercial, they're financial. He does projects for them like evaluate, you know, the financial status of a company that they want to do business with or do a merger with. Anyway, here's what he wrote just this morning. He said, this is from my Russian contact, he said. And he's got a couple. He said, there's official chatter in the German press that confirms your thoughts of an exit from the European Union. Many are now unusually vocal, whereas before they were not. Commerce is becoming very vocal. The commercial sector is becoming very vocal now on the damage done by the U.S.-led sanctions. The damage is directly against the Germans' economy and also other indirect damage, like to their suppliers. He says, I refer it as the following. He concludes, Germany has a choice to stick with the debt-ridden war machine of the West or to join the gold-backed BRICS economic model that promotes mutual cooperation and interests. And I conclude very simply after hearing this and a little back and forth discussion with him, NATO is now dead. Nazis are on the rocks. This is his conclusion, my conclusion mixed. The Nazis, I mean, we use that term loosely, but we've got fascists running the British, the United States, and the European Union. The fascists are promoting war at every opportunity. They are not about commerce. They are not about mutual win-win situations. Okay, so the Russian source feels that the CEOs are very vocal to Merkel and the German government. They're voicing their complaints. A big division is going on now in Germany. The division has the political and bankers, the political side and their bankers. The bankers run their politicians. And Merkel's, you know, I think, a resistance to this. So you have that on the one side, and then you have the big industrialists on the other. Remember, there are 3,000 to 5,000 German companies that are working with Russia. I mean, this is not in the press. It's not well understood. It's hardly ever discussed. But for every dollar that the U.S. has involved with trade and commerce with Russia, the Europeans have 10 times that, and the Germans have even more. So we've got a situation here where Germany is very protective of its economy, and they're just not going to permit their economy to get wrecked. They're just not going to tolerate much anymore. The U.S. is exporting a disastrous war with European casualties, but for what purpose? I wish the American people and Canadian people would comprehend what was going on. What's happening, I believe, is that the U.S. economy is collapsing. And the U.S. leadership wants the European economy to collapse also, so they can install this pan-Western totalitarian state. It's called the NWO. I don't like referring to it like that, but they're trying to create a series of fascist states run by Satanists and Nazis. And the Germans are in the way. The Germans are protective of their economy. I like to point out a very important item, a factor that goes back 30 years. In the 80s, 1980s, the United States started this outsourcing phenomenon. And the first big shock was with Intel. Intel is going to move its fabrication plants from California to the Pacific Rim. We're talking Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, all this. And we used to think, oh my God, this is me and my gang of colleagues, workers, where I was at the time. We thought, this is not good. Okay, so it actually continued and accelerated with a climax in 1999 and 2000 with the most favored nation status given to China, with a lot of foreign direct investment for industrial and commercial development and fabrication plants and industrial plants and foundries and you name it. It went to China. Germany did not participate in that. Germany instead conducted what they called a labor social pact. And that was to reduce union wages by about 15% and to bring about more guarantees against the outsourcing of German industry. So we've got a severe break between the United States and Germany, and that is the main theme of this interview and motive for it. Because there's another funny little, not so funny, an unusual little fact that has come to my attention. In the last 10 years, the Germans have moved their pension funds down from about 40% to about 5% in their stock market exposure. So the German pensions are now reducing in a huge way their exposure to stocks, while the United States remains with its pension fund exposure steadily at 50%. So you've got a conflict now. The Germans are thinking the whole economy is in trouble. The threat of recession is huge and acute, and we're going to reduce our exposure, and we don't want, this is one of my 4 violations coming up, we don't want the Draghi European Central Bank to proceed with monetizing the debt and monetizing the financial market. This is what the United States is doing. We're monetizing the bond market for treasuries and monetizing the stock market.
I read yesterday that central banks are actually buying stocks, and they're not just supporting them, through money printing, etc., and giving it to Wall Street Bank. They're actually buy the stock market, especially the Dow.
Yeah,
this is not just the Fed. It's like the European Central Bank, Bank of England. They're all playing the stock market, which is the reason why it's been high in the U.S.
I hear that the Federal Reserve owns a quarter of the U.S. stocks. Okay, well, this cannot stand. We're monetizing the entire. We're not just monetizing the debt situation, the debt structure. The Western central banks are monetizing the entire financial structure. They're monetizing the big banks. They're monetizing the bond market, the debt market. They're monetizing the equity market. I think they're going to soon monetize the entire municipal bond market. At the same time, you've got all these very queer developments, a return to the subprime markets. You've got subprime underwriting of home mortgages and car loans and student loans. We didn't learn anything from 2008. We're just going down the same path all over again.
They're doing it in an even bigger way than before. But to summarize what you've said so far is that Germany is the big prize, and there's a tug of war for Germany between the U.S. faction and the BRICS Russia-led faction. And if Germany pulls the banker plug and aligns itself with the East, then pretty much game over for the Western faction. Is that what you're saying, Jim?
Yes, it is, and it's really coming down to two choices for Germany, and I've gotten confirmation from The Voice very directly a little over a week ago. I think it was in the early part of August. I said to him, I gave him a challenge. I said, well, what's it going to be? Is Germany going to permit damage to their economy, or are they going to do what's necessary, which will probably involve scuttling the banks and causing a derivative accident? And he said they're going to scuttle some banks and permit a derivative accident. They're going to preserve their economy and their industry. It was a direct reply. There was no equivocation, no hesitation. They have two choices. They can join again, and remain with the war and the sanctions and wreck their economy for the purpose of building this series of global fascist states. Or they can depart from the US and EU fold. They can work with the gold standard as a dollar alternative and build up the Eurasian trade zone. They've already got some damage. They've got a couple % declines in industrial output, and they're not going to tolerate this in Germany. They're not going to permit their economy to go down the toilet just so the United States can create a firm enemy with Russia, while they give the Europeans this empty assurance that they can make up for the gas and oil shortfall that Russia would be cut off from in Germany. The Germans have 30% of their crude oil usage, the supply coming from Russia. The Germans have 40% of their usage, the supply coming from Russia for gas. So oil and gas, this will not stand. The damage has already come to the German economy. It's not going to be permitted to go out of control. They're not going to wreck their economy just so the unelected European Union commissioners, all those pedophiles and Satanists and fascists and black nobility groups with their qualifications in ugliness, they're not going to win out. The Germans are going to flip, and it's going to be exciting, except it's going to be very disruptive. Here's kind of a sequence that I expect is going to happen. The Germans are going to have to say, we can't support the dollar anymore. We can't. We must work closer with Russia and keep our industry alive and keep our jobs. We don't want 20% unemployment like you have in the United States. We don't want 30 and 40% unemployment like they have in Spain. We don't want to go down the path the United States has gone down. It's very unfortunate, but they're going to preserve their industry, and they're going to be working with Russia and China on a dollar alternative. Now, they're going to call it the dollar alternative, but it's really a return to the gold standard. And in order to bring this about, Germany is going to probably very soon pull the plug on a couple of banks. And I don't know which banks they're going to be. There's always 3 or 4 that are mentioned as very vulnerable and exposed and insolvent to an extreme degree and dependent on aid money from the government and other forms. So here's what I think is going to happen. They pull the plug on a couple of German banks, and it causes an effect immediately on a couple of French banks. And that causes an immediate effect on 10 Southern European banks. I'm referring to Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And then wait a little while, there's a pregnant pause, and in a week or so, 10 days or so, 2 weeks or so, you start to see a couple of U.S. banks go down and a couple of British London banks go down. And then, as I like to say, the dogs of financial war will be on. and the U.S. will put blame on Germany as they continue to focus their attention on Deutsche Bank. The United States government committed a very serious foul against the French bank BNP Paribas. It stands for National Bank of Paris and merged with Paribas. Okay, so BNP Paribas was attacked by the U.S. government for sanctions violations against Cuba, Sudan, and Iran. They were fined $9 billion, and they were forced into an admission of guilt. The immediate reaction was from the French central banker Neuer, who said, this was a month ago, we really don't need to use the dollar in bilateral trade with France. Now, within the European Union, they use the euro. But outside, they're saying we don't need, implicitly, he was saying, when it comes to trade with Russia and China and those Eastern powers, including India, they don't need to use the dollar anymore. So we got the Germans and the French really angry because next comes the attack in a similar hypocritical way against Deutsche Bank. When the United States announced a month ago that they're going to focus their attention on Deutsche Bank, they announced what they believed to be the indictment charges against Deutsche Bank. Manipulation of derivatives and the Forex market. Are you kidding me? This is what the U.S. and London banks do. So the level of hypocrisy is going to get intolerable vis-a-vis the Germans, and we're going to see the Germans say, who the F do you think you guys are? We're done with you. And there's an incident, Dash, that came up 2 weeks ago that just alarmed me. Real briefly, the U.S., the British, and the Germans all concluded that the downed Malaysian airline in Ukraine was done by the Ukraine central government, Kiev, ministers, army, militia, their government. The Kiev regime was responsible. They had actual data to demonstrate that they were responsible. And the U.S. government said to the British, and the British agreed, no problem, we'll remove the BBC data. So they washed the online information. It was gone in a few hours. Then the U.S. government told the German government, we want you to wash your data too. We want no information on this demonstrated data and proof that Ukraine's government was involved and responsible for downing the Malaysian airline. And the Germans said, F you.
So you think that Germany is going to actually expose this information?
Yes, I do. In fact, I think it's going to become a parade. Not only I expect Germany to expose the information, but they're also going to expose what the overarching objective has been. They were told back in 2011, the Germans were, of the U.S. plan for a war in the near future in Ukraine. They were told in 2011 that Ukraine was going to be a target for scorched earth and cut off of the Gazprom monopoly of energy supply. And the Germans reacted in a way that the news did not report, even in the alternative news. The Germans reacted by saying, we want our official gold account repatriated. The motive for the German request for repatriated gold 3 years ago was being exposed to plans to destroy Ukraine and to bring about a fascist regime there. And the Germans thought, this is crazy, this is insane, this is a threat to the energy supply and the economy to the German nation. And they said, we will not let this stand. So in response to the U.S. telling Germany and their government to withhold information, the Germans told them, F you. We are going to work with Russia more closely, but behind the scenes, to bring about a dollar alternative and to reinstall the gold standard. So watch in the next couple of months, few weeks, the United States paint Germany as a villain. This is going to get weird. This is going to get very, very strange because the biggest allies the U.S. has in Europe, I mean continental Europe, are Germany and France. And I'm told that both are going to leave the European Union, leave the Euro monetary union, leave NATO, and walk away from the dollar.
Didn't the Hollande just dissolve the French government? Is that related to what you're saying?
Well, that's a common occurrence. We can't get carried away on parliamentary type decisions in Europe. There have been 80 different or 100 different governments in Italy in the last 50 years. They call a different new government formation every 6 to 10 months. What happened in France was Hollande realized that his coalition fell apart. So he just needs to form a new coalition in the parliament. They have a different system in Europe. They have parliamentary government, and no party has over 50% of the control. So what they do is they take a group that's got 38%, they get another group with 14%, another group with 6%. They make a coalition to oppose the other group that's got maybe in the 30s. That kind of a percentage support. So they make a coalition, and sometimes they're not held together with strong glue. It's more like handshakes and, horse trading, and yeah, we'll permit you to dominate this industry while we dominate the following industries. Well, unfortunately in France, things are falling apart because they got the stupidity of the austerity plan, which I call the poison pill. So they're wrecking their economy. They're keeping in place their stupidity for their social network and their, I don't know exactly what age you can retire in France, but it's a lot younger than fewer years in age than most other European.
I think it's 60, and they wanted to raise it to 62, and there was a big outcry.
Yeah, well, they can't tolerate that. They've got a social system in France that's beyond absurd, stupid, and insane. Their socialism has killed their country, yet they embrace it and will not let it go. All right, so Hollande is forming a new government. Big deal, who cares?
Okay, let's move on then. So basically what you are saying, what you have told us is that these events that are upon the horizon, if Germany allows bank or two, for example, Deutsche Bank, to go down, it's going to set off a domino chain of events, which is going to be like a nuclear financial collapse explosion, which will supersede that of 2007, 2008. Is that how you foresee it?
Yes. I think we're going to see a major multiple Lehman event.
Now, wow, how the heck can the global economy survive that?
How has the global economy survived QE and bond monetization on an unsterilized fashion? It has not. The QE with bond monetization has destroyed capital at an accelerated rate, and we're now into feedback loops. We're talking about destruction of economic capital structures that's now systemic. I regard what comes with the derivative accidents as liquidation events that the U.S., the British, and the Europeans have interfered with. Following Lehman, we should have had more liquidations. Instead, we had accounting rule changes.
So these are necessary removals of the cancers that are still afflicting the system.
Yes, we refuse the liquidations. So the Germans are going to start a derivative chain reaction that forces the liquidations. This is very, very big. We're not. I had a forecast, and I have no problem admitting when I've made mistakes in a forecast. Fortunately, it doesn't happen very much. I got a lot of big forecasts that have turned correct. But I thought in March that the Ukraine was going to collapse in 3 months, like June. No, I think it's going to collapse by the harvest season. I think that's the trigger event.
Let's talk about this harvest, actually. This is because Ukraine is a very important agricultural nation. So what's going on with their harvest, with their crops and harvest, and what's been happening? Because without that part of their economy, intact, I mean, they are going to have a double whammy of this civil war and an agricultural failure that is going to totally decimate their economy, is it not?
It is. I thought for a while that they would never really get to the planting stage, but I was corrected. I've got a couple of different sources, and one of them is a hat-trick letter subscriber who lives in the Kiev suburbs. I've got another source, not quite as rich, but he's a U.S. fellow with a Kiev Ukrainian wife who makes phone calls back home. Then I got this other fellow named Jaroslav who provides information out of St. Petersburg. He just used my squirrel mail, Contact Us, and provided some information. And the last guy I have as a information source is a Hungarian hat-trick letter subscriber who has direct contacts and clients in both Hungary and Ukraine, and I think he also said Bulgaria. So I've got some good information. What I've heard is that 80% of the Ukraine fields, we're talking quality fields at the same level as Iowa. Iowa, Indiana, Missouri, Iowa, Indiana, Illinois. This is the U.S. breadbasket. Well, that's what the quality is for the Ukraine soil. Very rich soil. So it's not just wheat. It's wheat and corn and beans and peas and lots of different things. All right, I heard that they had an 80% planting success. All right, well, that sounds not so bad. But now integrate the war, and I've got questions. Well, what about things like trucks and diesel supply and men who are not, toting a rifle, farm equipment, routes to market. They have some floods that have taken place in the western area where most of the farming fields are. They've got wrecked bridges. How are you going to get, crops to market if your bridges are down and you got flooded areas with roads out? I mean, they're not going to make
the roads. A couple of railway bridges destroyed actually stops that whole, bringing it to market business.
I think they've got, if you could get a good complete analysis, you could probably find 15 different factors that will interfere with bringing harvest to market. I don't think the Kiev regime is going to make it past the harvest season. I think the whole tide of the war has turned, and the propaganda is now getting exposed. The U.S.-based propaganda is becoming laughable. I hear things like you've got a cut in 3 or 4, the U.S. financial news and network news and political news. It's down by a factor of 3. The share, the watching percentage by the public, and instead you've got a tripling of alternative news networks like the internet. So you're seeing a decimation of the propaganda networks. Oh boy, I tell you, it's kind of exciting, except you have a lot of people who are being killed. The Kiev regime is using artillery to shell communities in the eastern provinces, and this is what needs to stop. You have entire cities, little cities in eastern Ukraine, without water, without food, without electricity. And
is that what the Russians are then bringing in these humanitarian convoys to bring supplies to them? And they've been painted as military operations by the West, but that is. I believe there is some truth to it that the Russians are actually sending the eastern Ukrainians real supplies that will help them survive.
I think they are. If I had to put a figure on it, I'd say 90% of all the convoys going into eastern Ukraine are to prevent death, prevent the drought and famine, prevent starvation. They're without electricity, without food, without water. I mean, what the hell? These Kiev killers, they're fascists who, we get this funny little chain reaction that's going around. It's a big vicious circle. But the U.S. will order through their Langley propaganda offices, the ministries in Kiev, to issue statements about what's going on inside Ukraine with a situation in a couple of eastern cities or whatever. And then the U.S. quotes them. And then the Kiev people quote the U.S. And then the Associated Press makes a story out of it. Where does it start from? A propaganda desk out of Langley. I mean, this is absurd.
But the Russian press I read is reporting, more accurately, and a lot of the information that's what's actually going on in eastern Ukraine or in Ukraine itself. You have to go to these Russian and even perhaps Chinese sources to get the real picture.
Yeah, it's amazing. One of the biggest casualties coming from this war could be the Western press. This is an amazing development.
Well, I'd be all for that. I'll share that.
Well, let's get to this Merkel peace plan here, Dash, because...
Okay, yeah, let's move on to that. But before we do, let me ask you one question. So do you think then that Ukraine will return to the Russian sphere of influence once this current Kiev regime, takes off to Switzerland or somewhere over the heck they're going to head off to in exile?
I think we're going to see Ukraine split up into 3 or 4 parts. I don't think it's going to stand as is. To begin with, Crimea is not going to go back into any kind of a Ukraine fold. Ukraine is deeply divided. Crimea is the host of the only warm water Russian Navy port in the world. And that's what the U.S. tried to cut off. They wanted to cut off the Russian military from having an access warm water port into the Mediterranean through the Black Sea. And it's just not working. So you're going to get eastern Ukraine, I think, eventually becoming some kind of an independent small state with a very strong Russian affiliation and later part of Russia.
It'll be almost like a Russian satellite state like in the old Soviet Union. Okay. Yeah. Now, I read just a couple of days ago these meetings that went on between Merkel and Putin, and so what tell us about that? Is Merkel actually making overtures to Putin and trying to put in place some sort of secret agreement with them in their movement towards the east, which really surprised me because I thought Merkel would have to depart office before this German shift to the east would take place?
I think Merkel has already departed office, and that's what's happening right now. Take a close look at what Merkel's been doing in the last month. Has she really been conducting matters of German economic and banking state? I think she's been on vacation. So, I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to formal office. I pay attention to activity and what's going on, and that includes behind the scenes. Merkel is in a tight position. I actually had a forecast back in February, March, and April. This is when Merkel was reelected. Can you imagine in the United States a president being reelected and then within 3 months announce his resignation? That's what's happening in Germany. Merkel has already announced, this happened a month ago and completed my forecast. Merkel announced that she was going to resign and not complete her term. This is unprecedented. What has been happening? Well, once again, the politicians in Germany, along with many of the European nations and the United States and England, are run by the bankers with puppet strings. Okay, Merkel decided, rather than to continue on this disastrous path as a banker puppet, I'm going to resign. So after she announced her resignation, but before she actually did resign, she's going on in this peace project, a peace pact. I call it the Merkel-Putin Peace Pact. And take a look at what its components are. Very simply, it's a guarantee of Crimean independence and annexation formally by Russia. The U.S. press and the Western press omitted that after this whole regime change took place, Russia conducted a referendum in Crimea immediately. This happened back in March, and 95% of the Crimean population voted in favor of joining Russia. The U.S. press did not mention that key fact. It's a horrible omission that points to propaganda and bullshit for news. So, Merkel wants Crimea to be assured in the Russian fold, the Russian camp, and their naval base implicitly to be safe. In return, Russia will guarantee supply through their many different supply chains, pipelines, LNG facilities, gas pipelines, Gazprom pipelines, Nord Stream, South Stream. There's another pipeline. I don't have the name at the tip of my tongue. But Russia will assure Germany and Europe, but in particular Germany and Europe, steady, secure energy supply, both gas and oil. The United States doesn't like this. It's a win-win situation that Putin and Merkel are trying to bring about. The United States doesn't want a win-win situation. They want a lose-lose situation so the European economy can be wrecked, just like the U.S. economy, and they can more easily install their global totalitarian state. The U.S. wants Europe to be crushed economically. And instead, I think we're going to see Germany do two things: pull the plug on some banks that cause a contagion that hits New York and London. And the second thing is to bring about a peace pact with Russia that defuses this situation, and I think will force the splitting up of Ukraine. Hey, look, Ukraine is a very strange country. I mean, it's got all kinds of divisions. It's got, loyalty to Russia on the east and Crimea. It's got a different language. It's not Russian speaking in the western provinces. It's not actually a real firm, stable Slavic language. I've come to learn that it's a mix of 3 or 4 different languages, including Russian. But there's a tremendous ethnic and societal split. They're always arguing in Kiev whether certain meetings would be in Russian or Ukrainian or both or bilingual, just translate in the background with headphones. They're always arguing, well, what are the schools going to teach? Are they going to teach Russian? Well, in the East they do. In the West they don't. I'm talking about within the provinces of Ukraine. So it's a very strange country, and at the same time, it's got a very bleak and blighted history for white women trafficking, for Nigerian fraud cases doing their banking in Kiev without questions. This is a scummy historical background that the country has. And I think...
Yes, of course, and also they did have, it has been run by the Nazis going back to pre-World War II days. Their regimes have been very... not just Nazi supporters, they've actually had real Nazis running that country in the past.
And now, take a close look at the ministry offices in Kiev. You find fascists. They've got their own fascist movement with armbands and swastikas, and this is what the U.S. supports. I mean, it's not just that the U.S. supports Al-Qaeda and organizes and runs Al-Qaeda for terrorism across the Middle East. They're running and organizing the fascist militias that are doing raids on states like Ukraine, where immediately after the regime change and the coup d'etat, the United States whisked off 33 tons of central bank gold. Take a look at the heads of the ministry offices in Kiev, and you find a long list of people who come from a small nation in the southeast corner of the Mediterranean and have a lot of experience with their security agency that starts with the letter M. I mean, this is a fascist little project that is going to backfire and has already begun to backfire. I'd like to point out, I've got a number of, different viewpoints, and they're not bizarre. They're backed up by a lot of information and sources, but Putin did two things. Putin and the Kremlin did two things in the last several months that really pissed off the Western elite. The first thing they did was they had a serious break in 2012 and 13 with the Rothschild bankers. Now, for those who aren't familiar, Rothschild family bankers and their extended cabal have control of 95% of the central banks in the world. They don't control Iran, they don't control Syria, they don't control North Korea. That's a short list that they don't control. So there was an agreement that had been made 10 years ago with Putin and the Western elite. And Putin finally said a few years ago, we don't want to do this. In fact, we'd like you Rothschild bankers to get the hell out of our country. You've caused a lot of problems in the world. You are behind the Bolshevik Revolution. And we don't want you around anymore. All right, so there's been a break with the Rothschilds, who used to manage a lot of Kremlin money and not anymore. The second big violation, the second big break, was more the entire Kremlin leadership and their operations with ministries. They started interfering a year ago with the U.S.-Afghan heroin movement. They've interfered with the Afghan heroin trade routes. The Kremlin has interfered with the U.S. military and Langley heroin distribution routes. The Putin and Kremlin crowd have interfered with the trillion-dollar annual heroin business coming from the Afghan scene. It is the main motive behind the Afghan war. We're talking about a 15-fold increase in heroin production since the U.S. took control of the entire, well, let's just say 90% of the Afghan production. There are numerous photographs of U.S. military patrolling the poppy fields. Those pictures don't make it into the U.S. press, into the U.S. newspapers and Time and Newsweek magazine, certainly not Business Week. So Putin booted out the Rothschilds, and the Kremlin interfered with the U.S. heroin trade, without which the U.S. banks would fold in 1 month. So we got a lot of things going on, Dash, and I think we really see the U.S. Nazis and the European and British Nazis on the run. I had some very intriguing information passed on to me a couple of days ago that the British are going to turn their backs on the dollar and the Americans, and the British are going to work more closely with a dollar alternative, a gold standard, the BRICS. They're going to try to get carve out a role for London in the Eurasian trade zone. And I think it's going to be an interesting battle because the contest, what's the word, competition, will be between the German financial center of Frankfurt and the British financial center of London.
Well, if I was a betting man, I'd bet on London, but that's, but maybe they'll join forces.
I think the favorite is going to continue to be London, but the winner is going to be the dark horse, Frankfurt, Germany. And I've heard this from a really reliable source, The Voice. And he points out that Frankfurt is going to win a tremendous amount of investment banking trade from both Russia and China. Germany has already been hired by the Kremlin to help upgrade the entire Russian legal system, contract law system. At the same time, you've got the these 3,000 companies doing business in Russia. Russians are going to try to have businesses with stock offerings. They're not going to go to London. They're going to go to Frankfurt.
This is something, Jim, I also wanted to just interrupt you for a second, that people may not be aware, but historically, Germany and Russia have always had a lot of, trade and commerce and other political and even like familial ties where the Tsar, might marry a German princess and all that. So their relationship goes back centuries and even millennia. So, this is not something that new that they are going to work together. This has happened historically for a very long time. Much more so than it would has been, say, even with France or England. But Germany has had close ties with Russia for a very long time.
And I think the bad blood is with the London bankers. The London bankers and the Wall Street bankers helped to finance the Bolshevik Revolution. They helped to finance the rise of Hitler. These are things about the U.S. and London that people need to understand. The financial roots are Nazi, and now those financial powers have taken control since 9/11, complete control of the U.S. government. And I think we're going to see a reversal. Here's one of the most remarkable things that is coming up, and I do not know how it's going to play out. But Putin promised that he was going to reveal the complicity with actual evidence in gory, gross detail of the U.S. government and security agency and allied involvement and complicity in 9/11. The inside job story. And, first of all, what is the data? It's thousands of communications between the bankers, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the security agencies, the NSA, and a little ally on the southeast corner of the Mediterranean that controls a great deal, including the Council on Foreign Relations, so foreign policy of the United States. I think the British were also involved in this, the MI6. But, okay, then what other kind of information is there? There's a tremendous amount of information being collated right now and organized regarding weapons that were used on the World Trade Center. I'm talking about micronuclear devices. There were perhaps 1,000 of them used in the demolition. And the unique thing about nuclear devices is they have fingerprints. When you've got nuclear material, whether it's uranium or plutonium, it's decaying. It's got its half-life, which means you can determine its origin of date, and you can pretty much identify its clock. Apparently, the Bush family and the U.S. security agencies out of Langley saw fit to remove, it's a nice word for, say, steal, a lot of nuclear devices that went off to the southeast Mediterranean nation, and they got reworked. They got refitted. So these nuclear material weapons got divided up into thousands of smaller pieces that became demolition items. And Putin promised in February that he was going to reveal some of the 9/11 information piece by piece from the Snowden files. Anyone who thinks Snowden is a traitor is a fool. Anyone who thinks Snowden is betraying his nation is a total moron. This is whistleblowing at the level of state. And the biggest two questions I've got regarding this 9/11 revelation is, when will he reveal it and where will he reveal it? Because if he puts it out in ITAR-TASS, the Western press is going to say, big yawn, more propaganda coming out of the Kremlin. No, I think Putin is going to work with the German press to reveal the 9/11 inside job done by the U.S. Nazis. That's what I think's coming. And I don't know when. I just don't think it's going to be 2 years from now. It's going to be closer to 2 months from now than 2 years from now.
Wow. Then this world truly is in for some major shocks in the coming months. So the rest of this year could surely be very, very interesting, and we will await that such revelations, Jim, which people like yourself and many others in the alternative media have always pointed towards 9/11 as the smoking gun that proves, that needs a proper investigation as to how this world and the country is really run and who is doing what. So that is something that I believe would be probably the biggest news of the past 100 years or more. Moving on, before we close up, I know you want to discuss like what's happening in the precious metal mining industry, but can I ask you one more question, which is about this Gazprom announcing payment acceptance in ruble and yuan?
This was a forecast that I made back in about April or so, April or May. I said, watch these sanctions come into play, watch Russia react by saying, all right, you want to block our dollar? You want us to move perhaps prematurely into more reliance on the ruble, which I do not think is ready for prime time. I said back in April or so, watch Russia accept energy payments in yuan.
Yes, you did. You actually said that on my show as well. So I applaud your call there.
And, I thought that the reasoning would be simple. The Russian ruble is really not ready. It's not a mature, developed, strong, rigid currency. The Russian economy is not a real strong, rigid, robust economy. It's full of enormous supply networks, but it's not a real, mature, industrialized economy. And their financial system, and I'd like to point out, I've said this before, it's worth a reminder. The attack on Cyprus was an attack on the Russian central bank. The Russian central bank used Cyprus as a window for 100% of their Western banking transactions. So the U.S. tried to block the big Russian banks that were using that window in Cyprus to complete transactions with hundreds of import-export companies. The U.S. tried to block the Cyprus window for the Russians to convert treasury bonds into gold bullion, and they came out with a huge false story about insolvency of the Cyprus banking system, implosion of the regime, and a confiscation plan called the bail-in. Now, that bail-in was such a big story that it obstructed and obscured the real motive for the Cyprus attack, which was to block Russian banking system procedures. No, now we have this, I call it a way station. The Russians are going to accept Chinese currency. Well, this is remarkable. Wasn't the U.S. government plan to isolate Russia? Well, you can't isolate a country with 12 time zones. You cannot isolate a country that provides either the number 1, number 2, or number 3 rank for metals and energy supply. I mean, you could come up with 15 different types of metals and not just totally apart from oil and gas. Russia's the major supplier. Russia's in a contest with Saudi Arabia. I think they're going to overtake them easily to become the number 1 global crude oil producer and exporter.
Now, this year, you've talked about, of course, the demise of the petrodollar. So this is the biggest nail in the coffin of the petrodollar so far. This announcement by Gazprom of acceptance of payment in currencies other than the dollar.
Yes, it's a combination. The Saudis are going to start accepting non-dollar payments for oil, and that will mean all of OPEC. And then Russia will accept non-dollar payments for oil. Watch them accept euros from the Europeans and yuan for other nations. But bear in mind that this Gazprom announcement of accepting um, rubles and yuan for energy payments. It's from Gazprom Neft. It's the Gazprom Oil Company. It's not the Gazprom Gas Company. Anytime you see NEFT, like Rosneft, Rosneft means Russian Oil Company.
But that's only a step towards Gazprom gas accepting payment in currencies other than the dollar. I would think this is just one more step towards that goal.
Yes, exactly. So we've got a very big stake in the ground by a huge Russian company. Gazprom Neft does lots and lots of offshore oil drilling that also produces some gas, like in the Black Sea. Gazprom Neft is working with Rosneft and Exxon in numerous locations. So this is going to get very broad in the anti-dollar, the dollar alternative. They can call it whatever they want. I call it the return to the gold standard.
That's good enough, Jim. Now, talking about gold, before we go, since we've gone over an hour and I know you and I both have to wind this down in a few minutes. Before we go, our readers and listeners are always interested in what's happening in the precious metals industry. And you have some information about the mining industry as to what is going on there. Can you please talk to that for a few minutes before we close off?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of deep information. These are all kind of top-level headlines that are extremely important. But for instance, the Australian mining company, they're very important. North American and Canadian mining companies are very important, but the Australians are hugely important because it's a bigger proportion of their economy. They're seeing 30% budget cuts for exploration in gold mining. We've got extra.
Why is that?
Well, you got a suppressed gold price.
So then what the gold price at this moment in time cannot support exploration and development of new mines because the cost to produce it would be higher than what it can be sold for.
Well, basically, yeah. I mean, if you suppress the price of a product, you'll inhibit its supply. It's really that simple. I made a forecast back in 2012 that by 2013 we were going to see a 20% reduction, a decline in global gold mine output. I was wrong. And the reasons are simple. You've got obligations by these mining companies to fulfill supply contracts. You've also got projects that are under contract on an ongoing basis in a foreign country or elsewhere. So they must complete the obligation within the contract. All right, well, those contracts now are starting to be phased out, up for renewal, renegotiated, get the new royalties set up, new supply contracts put in, and there's a big disruption. For 2 years, we've seen lots and lots of different mine projects under strain. Some got mothballed, some never began in full operation because a mining company doesn't want to go into full operation when they see they're losing money. I mean, these are business decisions.
Yeah, makes sense, yes.
So we've got some analysts coming out saying that the global gold output could decline by 50% in the next 2 years.
What the heck are the Indians going to do then?
I think they really need to get their act together and start with some Himalayan mining projects because they got a lot of mountainous regions. They've got a lot of capital. They've got a lot of engineering know-how. They need to start doing some domestic gold production.
They need some guys from British Columbia to go down there and show them how it's done.
Yeah, so you have all kinds of different mothballed projects. You've got pressures from the board of directors to continue to make profit, which has brought about a very unfortunate phenomenon in the gold mining industry. This applies to silver too, but silver is unique in a way that I'll describe in a minute. For the gold mining companies, they've been basically rating their best properties. If you've got two mining projects, let's just keep this real simple. One, you've got a $900 to $1,000 cost per ounce to produce. And you've got this other, Project B, where it's about, 1150, 1200, 1250, a little more marginal on its profitability. They're going to focus on Project A because it's got a bigger profit margin, and they can keep the shareholders happy, and they can keep their loan covenant directors at the banks happy, and they can keep their corporate bond owners happy. So the unfortunate phenomenon is the bigger mining companies that have a portfolio of projects are going after accelerated production in their lowest cost projects, and they're draining them. So they're draining their best projects, exactly the ones they should close down. I think they should do a strike on COMEX supply.
I think, yeah, they all stopped supplying, which is happening anyhow. It is surely going to have a boomerang effect, and the prices will then hopefully rise to the level that they ought to be at, giving market fundamentals.
Well, that's the market for metals, but what about the market for the mining companies? I mean, you can't do that. That's the problem.
No, that's what I'm saying. If the mining companies, once their contracts are fulfilled, they should just mothball everything until the price rises.
No, that's what I'm in sync with you, and that's the problem. What would happen to the market for mining stocks?
They would be killed.
They would be killed, and that's what's not going to happen. But funny that is precisely what's happening to the smaller companies. We got two records that I like to point to. There's a record number of companies, mining stock companies, that have lost 90% of their value in the last 2 or 3 years. There's another record number of small mining companies that are now selling at 1 penny or less. These are not good records. So
it's a penny stock. Is that a good investment to buy, like whatever, like 50,000 shares of these, and hopefully in the future this could be a big payoff?
Not if it's delisted.
Okay.
I talk to people and they say, how much more can these stocks go down? And I say, well, how about 50% more in the next year? Like from 7 cents to 3.5.
So
they say, well, gee, that can't happen. What do you mean it can't happen?
It can, of course it can happen, and we have seen it happen. So what you're saying then is that it's the real McCoy that people should be collecting, which is the real metal, not the mining shares.
Right. Gold and silver, coins and bars. I mean, I think it makes perfect sense that if they're going to suppress the price of a product like silver, and it's stuck at 19 to 20 or 21, buy as much of it as you can find. Why would you want to buy a company that produces silver and is leveraged to the price of the suppressed silver? I don't have anything to do with that. I told my clients back in 2008, get out of the mining companies, just leave them alone. Buy gold and silver coins and bars. Eventually you'll have trouble buying the bars and coins because there'll be shortages. Eventually the mining companies won't produce as much because there'll be shortages. And eventually you're going to see these mining companies go belly up and be bought out by the majors. I think we're going to have
Barrick Gold. We have a Barrick Gold here in Ontario, not too far from where I am. So I guess they must have their hound dogs out looking for these companies.
I think Barrick is going to be a casualty. A lot of people point to Barrick as an upcoming major acquirer. They're going to go on the merger acquisition trail. No, not at all. There was an attempted merger by Barrick with Newmont, and that started 2 years ago, and it went nowhere, and it got revived 1 year ago, and it also got stalled. And I like to point out that Barrick, I think, got stuck at the discovery phase with its merger partner. I think Newmont took a close look at the Barrick books and saw the grotesque, corrupt evergreen contracts. used in the 1990s to sell huge tonnage of gold and never deliver it. That was a price suppression tool that was permitted by Mulroney and the Bush family as the secondary board of directors. They had an elite board of directors in addition to the operational board of directors. In other words, it's a crime syndicate. So we're not seeing mergers with Barrick because they cannot get past the discovery phase with a legitimate partner. So I think they're going to be isolated and eventually use narcotics money to buy out companies, but only small companies. That's what I think is coming.
All right, Jim, you know what? It's always, well, you give us a lot.
It is positive, but it's going to be very disruptive. What I'm basically saying, as the main message to the first half of this interview or more, is NATO is dead. The alliance with the United States and Europe is dead. You have special force type troops from France and Germany and the Dutch who are fighting against the U.S.-led regime in Kiev.
So it's not necessarily a Ukrainian civil war that's taking place. This is a bigger battlefield of bigger players that are fighting on the fields of Ukraine.
Yes, we have now the Europeans fighting against the United States NATO alliance. So I think NATO is dead, and the next big battle is going to be over, say, a forced phase out with 5 steps to get the United States military out of Germany and out of Ramstein. I mean, this is enormous. I think we're going to see a phase out of U.S. troops and military from the Ramstein Air Force Base, which is the biggest of all the NATO bases and the biggest military hospital in Europe.
That's very, very almost difficult for a lot of people. It will be difficult for a lot of people to believe, given that they've been there for like what, 70 years now, and
yeah.
Right. But I guess all things do come to an end. There's always.
Well, let's focus on why a big crowbar will be put in there. The U.S. government will say to Germany, if you're going to work closely with the BRICS nation, you work closely with Russia and China for a dollar alternative, then you are an enemy of the U.S. state, and we do not want you to have anything to do with contact with our military. The U.S. will eagerly do stage 1 of the 5 stages to evacuate Ramstein. They don't want to have the risk of U.S. military personnel being in contact with the German turncoats. NATO is dead. And as long as the Germans are going to be fighting against the NATO troops on the battlefield and fighting against the New York and London bankers with the gold standard installation, we're going to see the break very rapid between the United States and Germany.
Well, that, my friend, I think is something good, that a break is necessary. Otherwise, we are headed for a global, like you said, a fascist state, and that is something which is not in anybody's interest, except perhaps the very few elites that have their hands on the steering wheel of this global financial system. So it's good that somebody's trying to pry those hands off now. So before we close out, Jim, please go ahead, share your website, share the information about yourself and your products that you want to share, and we shall then bid adieu until next time.
Okay, let me just finish one little point. I put a delay on it. I was talking about the gold mining cutbacks and mothball projects, and I said there's an interesting point regarding silver. Silver is produced in no small amount as a byproduct for copper mining, for zinc mining, for lead mining. And lead's very important for war because lead is for bullets. Okay, so as the economy suffers, bout after bout and decline and chronic recession, you're getting lower demand for industrial metals. And as a result, you're seeing lower output for silver byproduct from those other industrial metals.
So what you're saying is that the silver production is also declining like the gold production?
Yes, except for the primary silver mines. So where you see silver as number 2, 3, 4 in output, like in a primarily zinc lead mine in the Andes of South America, silver's down the list. Well, if they cut back on production for zinc and lead, like the other ones cut back for production of copper, you see less secondary byproduct silver output. So the recession is aggravating silver output. It's a very interesting point. It's not true for gold. Gold has much more primary gold mining. There's some that comes with copper, but the phenomenon is much more the case with silver, because silver comes with other industrial metals in many, many different mining situations, and the geology is just that's the nature. But anyway, to sum it up,
so what you're saying is that silver is then the better bet for us, the people, than gold is, and I think you should rename your website to silverjackass.com.
Well, maybe. I point to the fact that central banks own a lot of gold, but they own no silver.
You know what, I might want to add, sorry to interrupt you, Jim, but I was reading that Indian people are buying a heck of a lot of silver now.
Well, the restrictions are on gold, and the extra taxes for duties are on gold, so they're turning to silver.
Yes, in a big way.
In a very big way. Very big way. So, I like to point out that central banks own gold and no silver. The U.S. used to have a stockpile dated way back to 1910 or so with President Teddy Roosevelt. They had a 6 billion ounce silver stockpile. And around the year 2006 or 7 or 8, the U.S. stockpile went away. It's gone. Silver stockpile gone. So the other side is that industry demands a tremendous amount of silver and a trifling amount of gold. So on the supply side, silver wins. On the demand side, silver wins. And what comes in the next few years, I think, is gold making a huge move up and silver making a huger move up, 3 to 5 times as big.
Oh, amen to that. I hope that comes sooner than later.
Okay, well, just a little closing wrap on my website. It's goldenjackass.com. I had the 10-year anniversary in May, was very excited about that. I just had another milestone a few days ago. 10,000 orders for the hat trick letter. I wish I'd retained them all, but unfortunately, people come and go, and they stick around for 2 or 3 or 4 years, sometimes more, and they come back after they've gone for a while. So it's a revolving door, but it's a building. It's a little arena that's building, and it's an amazing experience to be part of. But goldenjackass.com is the website. It has a lot of free information. It has free articles, not as many articles as a few years ago when I did one every couple weeks. And the first 5 years, I did one every single week just about, except for some holiday weeks. Now I do a public article once a month, and sometimes I do back-to-back. But the public website also has links for interviews like this, podcasts like this, YouTubes like this. And I invite people to come take a look and take advantage of some of the free information and then sign up for the newsletter. The Hat Trick Letter has 2 parts, 2 different publications every month. One is called the Money War Report, High-Level Dealings, High-Level Battles to Defend the Dollar in its Corrupt Regime, and you know, bring about the reinstallation of the gold standard. This is the solution that's being resisted. We're going to see the gold standard reinstalled. It will not be done by the United States. It'll be done with the U.S. kicking and screaming and therefore falling into the third world. The second report that I have is called the Gold and Currency Report for ground level developments like coin demand and, you know, movement through the Hong Kong window into China and different developments in India, which is a very important country that has extremely small trust for paper money and paper assets. So a lot going on, Dash. It's exciting. I wish there wasn't so much devastation and loss of life and loss of what I like to refer to as life savings. I say to my father, I say to other people in my family, isn't it amazing that you protect your head and your shoulders and your clothes with an umbrella, with a forecast due to a forecast of rain, more than you protect your life savings with a forecast of a dollar demise?
Yes, yes, that is sadly true. That most people are not aware of what what is happening in the realm of something that is very important for all of us, which is our economic health. And that's why we appreciate your information, Jim, because it points us in the right direction and also gives us, how we can prepare for these times of turmoil that are not just ahead. They're already we are in those times, but hopefully we are going to come out on the other side with something that is going to be better.
Well, I think the minority of North Americans and English-speaking folks on the other side of the Atlantic and Pacific, the minority are going to be protected with gold and silver investments, and there are a lot of very unfortunate people who I claim wear red, white, and blue jockey shorts, and they're going to be devastated.
On that note, thank you, my friend. Thanks for, we were going to do an hour, now we've done 90 minutes. That's awesome. And I'm sure the listeners are going to really appreciate this information that you've given. I will look forward to our next talk, which I hope will be, real soon.
It's a pleasure being on, Dash, and I appreciate what you do, and I really enjoy our private conversations too. We have a lot of fun.
So do I. Okay, take care, Jim.
Okay, bye now.
Bye. Please don't.